Adam asked, what are we doing today? Chapter 5, obviously, network defenses. What does network defenses mean to you? Adam, now that we're Chapter 5, what do you think we're talking about, network defenses? We got to go back to what's a network, don't we?
What defends your network?
How? I got that part. Huh? Defend your network. Hmm? Can't go in, coming in and going out? That probably would be, and that's part of it, obviously. That's more specific, coming in and going out to firewalls. What other things can you do? You just did a layer 2 security. Can you do anything with a switch to defend your network? I hope that you can do something with a switch to defend. What could you do with a switch to defend your network? Change the default password. Yeah, that would work. Or just lock the switch up. Because by default, you can't telnet to a switch, can you? Anybody try that? Nobody tried that.
You have to set up the password to telnet in.
You have to set up the password to telnet in. Because if you don't, what it'll tell you is that you can log in, but you don't have a password, so you can't log in. No password. Yeah, by password it says password not configured or something like that. So what else could you do at layer 2? Wow. We're going to have to go back and redo that one, huh? Turn off all the unused ports? We talked about. Huh? Block. What?
Block MAC addresses.
Block MAC addresses, or only allow specific MAC addresses on a port. What are some of the other things that were available? Trusted and untrusted ports with the DHCP snooping. Say again? Port trunking. We could configure VLANs, port mirroring, so we can monitor it. Didn't know you could do that much stuff with a switch. You thought you just turned it in, plugged it on, turned it on and plugged into stuff, right? Just make sure everything's on VLAN 1, and that's a good thing. The VLAN 1 is the default VLAN, right? And there is a way to do VLAN, they call it VLAN spoofing, I think, where you actually put yourself on that VLAN.
Double encapsulation.
Double encapsulation. One of the things that we're using today, in this chapter we talk about a little bit about, a lot of people are using, and we use it in the building here, is voice over IP. What do you think you should have for voice over IP? Quality? Okay, good. Quality of service, huh? What if we put the voice over IP on a separate VLAN so that you can't take your can't enable and do the VoIP scanning and record everybody's telephone messages because they're not encrypted? Good idea. Typically, they do have their own. You have a data VLAN and a voice over IP VLAN. So what can we do? And this chapter is about, it's kind of a mishmash, but a lot of it, some of it at least, is about configuration and everybody's favorite subnetting. I think what you need to think about when you talk about security is start at the lowest level, because anything that you can do at the lowest level, you don't have to worry about at a higher level. We can configure the switch so that Sam can't come in and plug in his laptop like he did the other day. Right? Just plug it in. It was okay, right? Totally. They kind of have gotten the wireless. Where can you get to on the wireless? Has anybody used it lately? You have, I know. You haven't, but you did in the routers class, right? It was so bad. Why? Because you couldn't get to any of the internal resources, could you? And probably you got to make some real conscious decisions. Wireless is actually Thursday. We're going to start the wireless lab today. It's another one of these big ones where we're going to configure, do the research and then configure it to make it wireless more secure, because wireless is one of the real hazards to your network. The security is not all that grand, and there are steps that you can take to make it better, typically in enterprise, because you're going to have to run a radius server, which means you're going to have something to get the database from. But network defenses, what we want to do is another element of defending the network. So the objectives of this one are explain how to enhance security through network design. Network design would be subnetting, setting your network up so that everything's not available immediately. I think there's some other things that you might want to do in there. What about NetBIOS?
Watch that movie on that.
Watch the movie on that? Well, yeah. NetBIOS can be a hazard, but what about just turning off NetBIOS on your machines? Do Windows machines need NetBIOS? I hear a yes and I see a nose and I hear a yes.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. That's my Linux guys. Does Linux need NetBIOS? Linux doesn't even understand NetBIOS, does it? Uses IP addresses, host names, DNS. What if we turn off NetBIOS? What happens? Depends. Depends is exactly right. It may break some applications. But what is the hazard of NetBIOS if somebody gets onto the network and they double-click on network places? What do you see? Bunch of stuff. What protocol does that bunch of stuff that you see use? NetBIOS. What kind of configurations are you going to do? We're going to get to that. There are a couple of other things that I think, and they don't really talk a lot about them in here, that you should do is, what about the configurations of the computer itself? As we've talked about ERD commander to reset passwords, we've talked about off-crack to crack passwords. There are some other things, PW dump, password dump, which will dump the hashes. What if somebody can't boot to a CD, DVD? Will any of those tools work? So what about configuration control starting right at the computer? What's the first thing you need to do? Oh, we're going to turn off the boot to the CD, but what else do you have to have? Then we got to set the BIOS password. And yes, I know you can reset that. But what we're trying to do is take as many steps, orderly steps, as possible to protect the network. Say again?
You said you can lock the case.
You can lock the case, yeah. They're pretty ugly, and they're not really all that effective, kind of, sort of. But you would have to know, the individual, would have to know how to reset the BIOS on that particular machine. Again, not real difficult to do. But any time that you do those things, it takes some time. It's a step that has to be taken. One of those that you can take the 5-minute job and try to extend it into 2 or 3 days if possible. One of the other things, before you would do that, I think, is probably lock the door to the room that the device is in. And I think before you would do that, or while you were doing that, personally, I would leave at least half the lights on in the room. Otherwise, you could sneak in back there into the corner back there where Daryl is. Real hard to see from outside with the lights off, and with a flashlight that's not real visible, be able to see the things that you want to do. And when I talk about these things, you say, oh, yeah, this is just the school here, and who really cares? But what we're talking about eventually is in an organization where somebody might really care. Maybe in Matt's tax business. Could be a big deal if somebody got onto some of those machines, could it not, or would it?
Yeah, it was a big deal, actually. So it was kind of like poker, online poker, being service from the computer, and I had no idea.
Yeah.
Because I never used it. There was
Yeah.
only one person coming in.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's all it took.
But what if some intruder got on it? Do you have any personal data on it?
Personal, there's probably some
Yeah, probably.
Social Security numbers. And
Yeah, Social Security numbers and things like that. And that is what you've got to think about, not, oh, I'm a student coming into the classroom and what's the big deal if I get on a machine in here, because there are other protections as we go on, passwords, things like that. Filtering in the routers to keep us from this network off of things on other networks. For instance, I can't do a remote desktop to my computer at my desk because that's blocked off of this network onto that network. And that's part of what this is about, enhanced through network design. How are we going to set up our network to make it more difficult for somebody to discover what's in the network? How are we going to make it more difficult for them to discover our internal IP addressing scheme? That can be one of the big deals too. Define network address translation and network access control. Network address translation we've talked about before. Those of you who had Cisco should have done, at least the second one should have had a lab where you did network address translation. Network address translation is something that actually probably helped set us back and kept us solvent in the IP world for a lot of years. What network address translation did was make IPv4 work in spite of the fact that we were running out of addresses, so therefore we, the U.S., didn't have to adopt IPv6. IPv6 is a much more secure protocol than IPv4. V4 has no security. V6 does. IPsec, which we've done labs in the Windows classes, and we'll do some more with Cisco in the routers class. IPsec is a service that's ported from IPv6 into IPv4 to make it a secure protocol so that we can do the encryption with it. IPv4 inherently has nothing that's secure or encrypted. All of that stuff is available. Different types of network security devices, and explain how each can be used. We can talk about IDSs and IPSs, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, and you can do those on both the network and the hosts, and you can have hardware or software devices. Other things that we talked about earlier on, how do we do this to allow things in and allow things out? Probably going to be routers, something that we can filter the packets with. Routers and firewalls, generally speaking, is what we'll talk about there. Common mistake, attempt to patch vulnerabilities in a weak network that was poorly conceived and implemented from the start. What they're saying is if we got a bad network, when we patch it, we got a patched bad network. Do patches prevent everybody from doing everything? We could have really, really well-patched machines in here, and let's go back to what we were talking about. Somebody can walk in with a boot CD, DVD, change the password, and now they're on the network. What can they do on the network? That's going to depend on how well you design it, what they can find, how much knowledge they have, and how good they are at compromising systems. Some people are very good at it. I'm not. What are we going to do with these things? How are we going to design the system? I think I've told you the story. Why did we wind up with all these subnets in this building? Because of people like you in the security classes. And now we put you on a virtual machine, so we got you a little bit more isolated than if you were on these machines, on virtual machines. We have you on private networks behind a router that we can filter with, that we can watch traffic with IDSs, IPSs, because we do some things that, although not dramatic, I don't think, do have some potential to do damage. Hand out DHCP, well, other things. I mean, Cain and Abel, as a man in the middle, if you could run Cain and Abel in this room, could you get information that might be detrimental to somebody? And in fact, it has been done improperly, I might add. Somebody plugged in their laptop and ran, and they really did, and ran Cain and Abel, and the instructor had an email client. They kept checking the email, and guess what about email client? How secure is your password in your email client? Anybody ever done a scan to see it? Plain text. Plain text. So we get username, password for email. Instructor got a little perturbed, and rightfully so. about that. How could they do that? Well, they just said, hey, I'm the default gateway, and everything went through them. And they were the default gateway, so they saw all the traffic. That's why I say the tools that we use, you're certainly welcome to use them at home. Please don't use them anyplace else in this building. But how far does Keen Enable go? A broadcast, right? Actually, it goes less than a broadcast, doesn't it? That would be a broadcast domain. Broadcast domain. What does it depend upon? What does it depend upon? What does a man-in-the-middle attack depend upon? MAC address. We do some MAC spoofing. It depends upon the weaknesses in the TCP/IP protocol, and there are a number of those that we talked about the last time. But what can we do with these things? So, if we patch these things, patch the vulnerabilities, and we still have a weak network environment, so that somebody could come in and we didn't do our layer 2 configurations. And so Sam comes in and plugs in his laptop and just starts watching all the traffic. Will he eventually get a hash with your username and password as you log on to your account? May not be plain text, but if he gets the hash, what can he do? Now he can take the hash and put in a password cracker. If it's a good password, it's going to take a long time, and hopefully you'll have changed it before he is able to determine what it is. And that's the only thing that you're trying to do with strong passwords. Are you trying to make them uncrackable? No, because you can't do it. What you're trying to do is make it take long enough to determine the material's content so that it's no longer of any value. Secure network begins with the design of the network and includes secure network technologies. What kind of devices are we going to use? What kind of filtering are we going to do? How many subnets are we going to have? We're going to have a single subnet so that if somebody gets on, they can see everything, or we're going to break these things down into different subnets. What we've done, and no real big secret to you guys, is each room basically is on its own subnet. You got that one, right? The domain controllers are on a separate subnet. Some of the other devices are on separate subnets so that they become a little bit isolated from everything else. Is there any, again, single element to make the network secure? Now, what you want to do is make it more difficult as possible, as many steps as possible for somebody to compromise your system. Subnetting. Everybody loved the subnet in security too. True? Oh, yeah. Why do you need to know how to subnet? So you can break these things down. Are you necessarily going to do that? Well, if we use a 192.168, not a big deal. We use a 192.168, and then we just use a bunch of Class C networks. They didn't do that here when they assigned us our network addresses from Virginia Beach. We're using a 10.60. They're using a 10 range. Another campus is 10.50. Somebody else is 10.40. I think Virginia Beach is 10.10, which allows now us to do subnetting and supernetting, because when you get traffic out of Virginia Beach, if we supernet it, then everything with a 10.60 preface comes to Roanoke. Once it gets to Roanoke, the routers here, the internal routers, route that 10.60 traffic to the appropriate rooms, to the appropriate subnets. So you can break those things down. A logical addressing scheme can minimize the amount of work you have to do on the backside on your route tables and things such as that. How much do you want to do that? Because if we use a supernet and we add another network, big deal. It still comes here. The only thing you have to change is the router that the subnet's on. So how are you going to organize these things? Classful addressing, we got that split between the network and the host portion. The IP address originally was set on boundaries between bytes. And classful addressing was the original one. And we go back to RIP. RIP v1 is still classful. The other protocols, by default, EIGRP and OSPF, had an auto summary. By default, they summarize network addresses to the classful boundary. Now, you can turn off the auto summarization, but by default, they do that. So you have to go in and use the no auto summary if you want to actually use subnets with these things. Subnetting or subnet addressing allows the IP address to be split anywhere, allows for better use of network addresses. Now, if we're using private addresses, are we really all that concerned about conserving addresses? They're free. You just use them. What if you're buying addresses? Would you rather buy 300 addresses or 12? Because you got to pay for those things. The 12 probably is going to be the answer. You want to conserve addresses, and subnetting will do that. Some people use public addresses on their networks. And when we go between routers, we want to subnet, and we've seen that we can use a 30-bit subnet mask in order, and we still use 4 per connection, but that's better than using 256 per connection, particularly if you're paying for them. And if you're using public addresses, you are paying for them. The other thing that happens, subnetting and the private addressing, is it has allowed us to remain on IPv4 rather than going to IPv6. We're going to have to eventually go to IPv6, but I don't have any idea when. And I've taken some courses, and people say, oh yeah, I said, when I did this course 3 years ago, I said we would be there in 6 months, 2 years, or whatever else. There apparently is an article out there that said that they will have assigned all the available addresses by sometime next year. And then some guy from Utah, University of Utah, which was part of the original ARPANET, said, oh yeah, we got a couple of Class B subnets that aren't even being used. So how many addresses are still available? I don't know that anybody really knows. There are a bunch of them out there still. And by doing subnetting and by using NAT, we've been able to extend that to minimize the use of addresses. Because if we did that 10 address, Class A network, that's a pretty big network. Class B network's a pretty big network. So if somebody got a couple of Class B network addresses, public addresses, that's a whole bunch of addresses that they may want to let somebody use for a price, obviously. Can essentially be divided into 3 parts: the network, the subnet, and the host. And we've been through all of that in the networking 2, I hope. And you've been beaten silly with those. So the subnet is just extending, as you recall, hopefully, extending the subnet mask to make the network have more bits and the hosts to have fewer bits. And you can't use the all zeros and the all ones, all of those things. What we can do, what they have done here in this picture is taken the 186. What's 186? What class? It's bigger than 128, right? And less than 192. So probably going to be a B. Which means that our default mask is going to be, what, 255, 255, 16 bits. What they've done is taken this thing, and I don't know that they show us here what mask they've used, but they 186, 98, okay, yeah, 192, 198.34 subnet. 34.0, okay, 192.168.34, I'm getting to where they're going. 34.0, the 34.128 network, so they have actually extended this on over, have they not, to make those networks work? How many bits do you think that subnet would be? We got 2 subnets here, do we not? 3 subnets here. Well, this one goes down to a 33. This one's 34. Taking this Class B and subnetted it. And remember, you don't have to necessarily make all the networks the same size in a classful. You just can't have overlap with any of those things. How many different combinations can you have? Many of them. If you have one network that has 20 hosts, you can subnet it so that it would support the 20 hosts, and then you can have the next one that has 100 hosts. You just can't use the same address in both of the subnets. So, why do we subnet? I've talked about conserving addresses and security. Why else would you subnet? Table here, huh? Broadcast. Decreased broadcast traffic. Decreased network traffic. Broadcast on the networks generally limited to individual subnets. When wouldn't they be limited to individual subnets? DHCP, yeah, if we allow the DHCP broadcasts through the router itself. Flexibility, the number of hosts on each subnet can be customized to the organization so that if we had public addresses in here and we had a room that had 8 computers in it or 10 computers in it, what we use 2, 4, 8, 16. We could subnet it so that we had 16 hosts in that room, because if we had 10, that's where we would have to go, isn't it? And let's say we had a room here that's got, 21 in it. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. We could subnet it so that it had 32 hosts. We have not used, and if we owned a Class C or a Class B or Class whatever, we've used just a portion of that network. And if you're using this sort of subnetting, you should start with the largest subnet and work your way down when you do the subnetting, so that the 20 or the 100 one would be the first one we would subnet, and then the 6, then the 20, then the 16, and on, and work the size down in that direction. Improve troubleshooting. We're having a problem with a machine, a network. We've kind of isolated it down. We've got a virus on the network. If we're subnetted, then we've helped ourselves out some. What can get through the router, what can't get through the router. And it really isolates the number of machines that you've got to check if you're having a problem. Improve utilization of addresses, we've talked about. Minimal impact on external routers, because if we logically organize this thing, we can subnet it, but we can still, in the route tables, use a supernetted or just use the original network address, the class full address, to send things backwards and forwards. Typically coming in and out external routes. Here, our external routes, how many external routes do you think we have? One. And it's, what kind of route do you think it is? It's a default route, because it can only go one place from here. It goes to the ISP. When the ISP sends us our traffic, how many routes do you think they have? One. Because it's the only place it can go. Once it gets here, it has to be separated by a router. When we're talking about those routes, we're talking about the public addresses, not the private addresses internally. When we communicate with Virginia Beach, we're using the private IP addresses, separate communication channels. So how many routes do you think we really need to get out of here to go to all of the other campuses in the world? And I'll give you a hint, we're a hub and spoke arrangement. When we send all the 10 traffic to Virginia Beach. And what does Virginia Beach do? They send all the 10.50 traffic to Greensboro, maybe, or wherever they are. The 10.40 maybe to Charlotte, or wherever those addresses are. Because when they started out, they used a logical IP addressing scheme to minimize the number of routes that have to go into the routers, the way that they assign them. Reflection of the physical topology. Hosts can be grouped together into subnets that more accurately reflect the way they're organized in the physical network. And that's all true. What else can we do with these things? What if we do VLANs? Can we separate the machines in different physical locations that are on the same network? One of the things we talked about we could do with a switch, with our switched network. If we do that, create VLANs, then we can have accountants in any part of the building and they're still on the accounting subnet. We can have designers in any part of the building and they're still on the designer's subnet. And it goes back to, again, part of the decreasing network traffic. Typically what everybody used to say, reason you subnet is, oh, let's say you've got these designers that have these huge files that they transfer back and forth to the server, to their workstations or whatever else. And you want to not allow them to monopolize the network traffic. That is one of the things that you may want to think about is when you do this, not only are you doing it for security, but subnetting so that work groups are together, obviously, and the people that require internally a lot of traffic amongst themselves, you put them on a single subnet. And that's the traffic that they're going to take up is on that subnet, not on everybody else's. Enhance subnetting, a single network, multiple smaller isolates groups of hosts, and hopefully the things that we've talked about, there are a number of issues with that this does help. The virus or the worm, we minimize the number of machines that get infected immediately. Hopefully we do. Depending on what kind of filters we have on the routers also. It depends on what kind of an infection you have, whether it goes across the network or not. Can utilize the network security tools, easier to regulate who has access in and out of a particular subnet. Going back to routers, we're talking about filtering here. Going back to firewalls and routers, we're talking about filtering here. Who can get into the network, who can get out of the network. Tells you one of the things that happens here is, and we don't actually do the configurations, but I can't remote desktop to my computer at my desk, which is, what, 100 feet away, but it's on a different subnet because there's a filter that doesn't allow that. What networks can different users use? What resources can different users use? That is one of the advantages of using subnets, the ability to filter traffic in and filter traffic out. It also gives you the ability to watch traffic in and watch traffic out, doesn't it? If we're really, really, really concerned about a group of users, or let's say a security class, and we want to see what they're doing, if we put them all in the same subnet, does it make it easier to monitor them? What if we're worried about somebody embezzling? Would it make it easier to monitor the traffic for that group of users? So you can do a lot of, I guess, surveillance or organize the users' computers into areas where you can do the surveillance that you want to do. Hide the internal network layout. Is that a big deal? Certainly can be. If somebody gets onto your network, if you got onto this network, where would you go to? Now, I want to say, yeah, it does, and no, it doesn't at the same time. It helps, but could you determine relatively quickly maybe where the domain controllers were? Don't think so? Where would the domain controllers be listed? What service? In Active Directory? What service? DNS. How hard is it to find out what your DNS server is? ipconfig all. As long as you have the authority to run ipconfig. All part of the, well, eventually you'll hear or probably have heard the term defense in depth. What can you and can't you do? Physical location. We're talking about somebody that's gotten onto your network. And the subnets allow us to hide the internal network layout, we hope, or at least obscure it to some degree. What subnets do, or NAT does, and we'll talk about NAT in a little bit, is obscures that network to the outside world, and that is a big deal. And that one you have to be kind of careful about where you put DNS, which DNS servers are allowed to resolve which addresses, and you don't want to allow zone transfers except in areas where you really want to share that information. Zone transfers are a really big deal. That's why we go back to DNS. DNS can be a real big deal, is a real big deal when you're trying to find these things. NS lookup, the lab that everybody loved to not do. NS lookup, what NS lookup does is it actually allows you to look into DNS if you know how to manipulate it. Virtual LANs, most network environments, the networks divided are segmented using switches. We're segmented using switches, kind of, sort of, aren't we? We have, what, 3 switches in this room? How many subnets do you think are in this room? I don't really know if that room over there's got its, we got its switch, but I don't know if it's got its own subnet or not. Have we turned off the ports? And we'll say, hey, no, we're not really very secure, because the switches are sitting right out here where you can see them. What realistically should you do with the switches? Lock them up. They should be in a locked container. They really should be. And all of the ports that aren't used should be turned off, should be disabled. You can do that, right? Shut. Interface, whatever. And I showed some of you the, boy, it's kind of a pain to configure, what, 24 ports individually? That's why there's an interface range command so that you can configure a whole bunch of them at the same time. But you don't have to do them individually. So all of those things should be shut down that with a manual shutdown that aren't in use, so that they're not available to users. And then all of the MAC, the MAC address assignment and things like that. But VLANs allow scattered users to logically be grouped together in different switches, and we've talked about that. We can have designers in different parts of the building. They can all be sharing the same subnet as long as we have VLANs, virtual local area networks. And if you think about that, what does VLAN mean? What does LAN mean? Local area network. I got the abbreviation. What does that mean? Yours. Yours. It's yours? What does that mean in controlling or in configuration? Local area network.
One building.
One building? Could be. A local area network could be conceived of as a subnet. So what we're really talking about in virtual local area networks are subnets, that the users on those particular VLANs are on the same subnet. That's the only real way you can control that stuff, isn't it? For real? Virtual, because we're not using physical switches, we're using a logical division in the switch itself. So what we're doing is creating the ability to have multiple subnets on a single physical device. And then allowing another switch to have multiple subnets on a single physical device and connecting these things together through trunk ports. That's another thing that you can configure on the switch, isn't it? Through trunk ports to allow what's called frame tagging, so that the 192.168.3 network goes to the 192.168.3 network, VLAN 3 perhaps, on a different switch. And the only thing the switch knows is this traffic goes to VLAN 3. It doesn't have any idea what the IP address is of it. But it knows it goes to VLAN 3 on all the switches that are trunked together, that are in the same domain. What's the hazard with trunking? What if I come in and plug my switch in, and if we're set into auto or preferred or any of that other stuff, what's going to happen? It's going to trunk. Dynamic. It's going to trunk. And it's going to trunk to my switch, and that's what it's going to do when it trunks to my switch. It's gonna set up all that VLAN stuff for you, isn't it? And then I'm gonna get all your VLAN traffic. So back to the switch, what can you do with it? I'm gonna keep pushing that because there is an awful lot of layer 2 configuration that can be done that I don't think's really addressed anywhere. I mean, have you actually seen it addressed a whole lot in here? Except you can do VLANs, and that's what this chapter says. You can do VLANs. What else can you do with a switch?
How do you get around doing trunking then if you need to use it?
You turn everything except the trunk port that you control, make them all access ports, except for the trunk port. We know which ports we're connecting switches together, don't we? We know which port goes out of the building, out of the room here. That probably should be the trunk port, right? And then we're going to have, instead of having them all set out to where you can go fool with them, we would have locked this thing up. What that would prevent, and there are other things obviously like the MAC filtering that we could do, would prevent Chris in the bank from going in and in his computer plugging in a switch. And then we get the auto negotiation and now you're trumped. You're getting all of the traffic from all the VLANs.
You're saying plug the switch in right where my cable is?
Right where your cable is. And then all you got to do is plug your computer into the switch and you're back on the network, right? Unless, what? We've taken other precautions. And I'm going to pick on the bank because that's one of the things that I think that if you think about it, that's a pretty big deal. Somebody can get into all this banking information. Or what kind of information can we get? Can somebody get? And then you could sell it to WikiLeaks, right?
You're talking about having access to IP. We can't get to it.
You can't get to it, can you?
You can't get to a command prompt.
Yeah. Can't get to a command prompt. Aha, security, isn't it? Yeah. Can you turn the command prompt off with policies? And we could go back even further. Policies are another part of Active Directory policies are another part of the security configuration. What things do you allow users to see and not see? Can't get to a command prompt. That's one of the configurations that we can configure there. Not being able to see attached hard drives is another thing that you can configure in a policy. What do you want to allow users to see and not see? There are lots of different things you can do. How are we going to make it secure? And are we going to make it absolutely secure? Is any one thing going to do the job for us? We could turn it off. We could turn the switch off. That'd help a lot, but then it wouldn't be very useful. Back to we've got to kind of balance between security and usability. Anytime that you put these devices on, there's a risk that somebody's going to compromise your system. The question is the risk worth the reward? It's always going to be a risk-reward capability. You put up a web page, is there a risk? If people can get to it, there's a risk. Is there a big risk? Probably not. That's why you set it in an area that I have here in a few minutes called the DMZ. That's outside of your private network, so that if it gets compromised, yes, you've lost that data, but no, somebody has not compromised your private network, the data that's there. Yep. So we want to set these things here. And this is, I think by accident, but this is really what we've got set up here, isn't it not? If you think about it, we have the work group switches that go to the machines that are in the rooms here, kind of like this thing shows. And then they go to, and this shows 2 core switches, but they go back to a core switch. A core switch is just a switch that all the other switches plug into. We don't really have the 2 core switches, and I think most of ours go back to a switch, but they go back to a layer 3 switch so that the VLANs can be switched. Routing, we would call it routing if we were using software. If we're using hardware, we'd call it a switch. What a layer 3 switch does is just switches based on IP address instead of based on MAC address. And then the other workgroup switches and core switches, the core switch connects all these things together. So that if we had the different VLANs in each of these workgroup switches with the frame tagging, they are all connected together so that the correct VLANs, all the VLAN 3 traffic goes to all the ports that are configured for VLAN 3, all the VLAN 5 to the ports that are configured for VLAN 5 throughout the organization because all the switches are connected together. Eventually, if we're using frame tagging and different subnets, what do we have to do? What do we have to have? That's not shown here. Still going to have a router somewhere, because can these different VLANs talk to each other? No, that's the reason. One of the reasons we create VLANs is to get the separation. Unless we do routing with them, router on a stick with a Cisco with the tagging capability and the tag protocol. And one of you guys were talking about and you were trying to change it to .1Q. Yeah. .1Q I think is now the default for Cisco. It had the ISL capability. You could change it to ISL inter-switch link, which is the Cisco proprietary. .1Q should work with all of the switches. Yes?
In that diagram, they show does each floor use all 3 servers as well? Or
these are just, well, it could be, or could not be. Yeah, we could. Yeah, if we had server 1 that only served the first floor, then all of the first floor was on the same VLAN, then we would put server 1 on that VLAN, and server 2, a second floor, we put it on the second floor VLAN. Depends on what kind of flexibility you've got. Yeah, but if we had server 1 on VLAN 1, and we had 2 machines on the first floor in VLAN 1, and 1 machine on the second floor in VLAN 1, and all 3 machines on the third floor in VLAN 1, then they would be communicating with server 1, not server 2 and server 3. Okay? VLAN can take place 2 ways. I think we probably already covered this when we talk about tagging. And tagging is something that there is a tag that's attached to the packet. And when it gets to the switch strips the tag off and sends the packet to the correct VLAN. If we're going to do routing, then we've got to configure the port on the router to understand VLAN tagging. Otherwise, it's not going to understand the packet. So you have to do other configurations other than just setting routing up on the device itself, so that it recognizes the tag and is able to communicate and use the traffic. Heavily dependent upon the switch for connecting and directing packets. Attacks on the switch that attempt to exploit vulnerabilities such as weak passwords or default accounts are common. We want to get in, and maybe we want to add ourselves to a particular VLAN. Maybe we just want to make the switch look like a hub. We can still do that, can't we? By flooding and MAC flooding. And there are tools out there that will assist you in doing that if you want to do that, if you want to get arrested in your workplace. Convergence, one of the most visible signs of unification efforts, is the process known as conversion of voice IP traffic over a single IP network. Voice over IP is used by many different companies, and we use it here. Why do they use it here? It's because it costs less, for one thing. Use it at home. A lot of people use it at home. There's a bunch of free voice over IP providers, are there not? Skype. How much does Skype cost? Computer to computer, $0. If you get a Skype phone, you've got to pay. If you dial a phone, you've got to pay a cost. I say Google Voice, I think, is voice over IP, isn't it? And it has to be because you run it off of your computer. And they were giving free calls. I don't know if they still are. They were giving free calls through 2010. I discovered that on like the last day of the year, and I haven't tried it since the new year to see if they're actually trying to charge for that or not. But voice over IP. The hazard of this is what? What if we don't put it on a separate VLAN and put that traffic on the VLAN with everybody else? Then that traffic is susceptible to interception. And if you look at K-enable has one of those, let's go get the voice IP, let's go do voice over IP capture as well as data capture, so that it has that capability also. Put it on a separate VLAN, the VoIP VLAN, then it's probably going to be a little more secure. The other thing that voice over IP uses is, see if I can get an IP phone. You ever looked at an IP phone? What is it that they don't have? They don't have a power cord. They don't have a power cord. Use power over Ethernet. So when they put an IP phone in here, they got to be plugged into. We got a PoE switch there that they have to be on the power over Ethernet switch in order to run the phone. You plug the phone into the power over Ethernet, and then you plug the computer into the phone, so that it gets daisy chained down, that they work together. But they're there. The traffic is just IP packets, TCP IP packets that can be intercepted. Cost savings, management, application development, infrastructure requirements, reduce regulatory requirements, and increase productivity are all the reasons they say to use it. And the reduced regulatory requirements is because it's an internet which really does have relatively little regulation, although they're trying to put more on it. The telephone system itself is pretty highly regulated. So people like to use that, and it is much less expensive to use this thing. Operating systems, soft phones operate from standard PCs, are vulnerable to operating system attacks, just like anything else. They have a phone spam, but they call it SPIT instead of spam, but it's there. Voice over IP protocols don't provide adequate call authentication and integrity protection, and it's going to be unencrypted. So voice don't encrypt call signaling. If they're not encrypted, if we capture them, then we can use those packets. Network acknowledgments can flood voice over IP targets with a denial of service attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. If we can attack any of it, if it's an IP packet, it can be attacked. Spam over internet telephony, and that's where the SPIT comes from. Spam over internet telephony is unsolicited sales calls and other nuisance messages. And people do that with fax machines, don't they? They find these fax numbers and they fax you things that you don't want. Same thing's going to happen here. Spam, you get calls based on IP address, based on the telephony. Let's take a break here and we'll talk about DMZs and NATs and things like that. Let's see if this will resume. We talk about something here, a term that you probably heard. What's a DMZ? What's a demilitarized zone? High network, but it comes from a military term, doesn't it? Yeah. A demilitarized zone where there's really no activity supposed to end. To Korea, they've got the demilitarized zone, the buffer area between the two countries. So we're talking about a buffer area, as James said, between your public network and your private network. Why do we want this? What's the objective of security? One of the big objectives of security. Put a web server in a DMZ, but what's one of the big objectives of security? Keep people out of the private network. These are the resources that we want anybody to be able to get to. Because if we're selling stuff on the internet, if people can't get to the web page, then we're not going to sell very much. But do we want just everybody in the world Do we want all the Russian hackers inside our private network? Do we want Sam inside our private network? Probably not. How do we prevent that? Then we put a resource outside that's got some filtering, because we're not going to allow them to see all of the ports. And that's where filter routers and sometimes two firewalls, there are a number of different ways you can configure this thing, but a filter router, which would say that anybody can get to maybe port 80 and port 443 or whatever resource that we're providing in the DMZ. The firewall then wouldn't let anything else, wouldn't let anything except maybe other things that we have allowed into our private network. So this picture here shows the firewall, the router, the internet, the router, we'll call it a filter router. This is one of those three-legged firewalls. Typically, what you can have is this means that the device has the DMZ port on it. Upside, downside. If I compromise the firewall, then I've compromised everything. Upside is easier to configure. You might have something in here where the router would connect to the switch, and then the firewall would connect to the switch, and then all these things would be in here, and then we would go through the switch to get to the DMZ. This is just the way that the device itself is configured. So from the internet, the filter router says, hey, anybody with any IP address that's trying to get to port 80, and that's why we ask the questions on and on and on and on, which port are we going to? Which port does your computer go out on? Ephemeral, some port. Do we know? We can look at it and see what port it's connected out of, but we don't know and we don't control it. It's called an ephemeral port, which is a randomly generated port number. HTTP request. So it goes out. So the router can only say in the filtering that we will allow any IP address that's destination is port 80, the service we're looking for, the web page that we're looking for, to go through this router to a specific IP address, the web server. The email server, we would say, hey, anybody that's trying to get to whatever port we're using, if we're using POP and SMTP 110 and 25, we'll allow them to get to this IP address and these ports. Now, there's some other configurations that you probably want on your email server so you don't become an open relay host, so that spammers can get there. This is just another picture, same thing, security through network design, DMZ, with two firewalls, a router, firewall, we're using two firewalls instead of a single firewall. You can use as much of that security as you want. And inside here, you may want firewalls running on the individual computers. That way, if your network gets infected, then it becomes more difficult for one computer to infect another computer. Downside is it also becomes more difficult to remotely manage these devices with the firewall. You've got to go put the firewall exceptions in. Network address translation. Two things here that I think that you should take away. And the difference between NAT and routing. And that's why those of you who have had me before, I've asked you on many occasions, what's the IP communication process? What's the first thing that happens when one computer wants to talk to another computer? 10.60.211.12 wants to talk to 10.60.211.30. What's the first thing that happens? Determines if it's local or remote. Then we're going to ARP for the default gateway or the IP address of the machine. Once it gets to the default gateway, one of two things can happen. If we route, what's going to happen? Same thing. We're going to have a source and destination IP address and a source and destination MAC address. If we're routing, the source and destination IP address is never going to change, is it? Huh? Well, no, if we're routing, first let's go through routing and then we'll get to NAT. Destination IP address going to change? No. Source IP address going to change? In routing. In routing. You're stuck on, we'll make a change in a minute.
You would get the address of the default gateway, would you?
Get the address, would you?
If you go through a router.
Why? Because what are we looking for at this point in time? If we use the default gateway, if we change the IP address to the gateway of the router, when the packet gets to its destination, where's it going to go back to?
The router.
Well, good. And then what's the router going to do? So, oh, it came from me. Golly, I don't remember sending this.
The router had that information for it instead.
Well, not yet. Not yet, because we'll get to a different process. If it's routing, do we change the source and destination IP address? No, because all we're looking for are MAC addresses change. Because it gets to the router's going to look at the source and destination IP. It's trying to deliver the packet to the destination. Is that, will you buy that one? And it does the same process. What's the thing it looks at? Is this a local or remote address? Is it local to any of my interfaces? And if it is, it then ARPs for the MAC address of the IP address that it's going to. What if it's remote? Then it ARPs for the MAC address of the next hop. And it keeps going down the line until it does that. The source and IP addresses don't change. Now, I think and James keeps trying to do, and I think what Adam's probably leaping into is natting. What does NAT do? NAT actually changes the source IP address. And it keeps a NAT table. So that we ARPed for that, and it was remote. It got to the default gateway. The default gateway was a NAT device. It actually would put the IP address of the default gateway into the source IP. And then we would go through all this other process, but we've changed the IP address. That means that we can take private IP addresses, 192s, 10s, 172s, send them to a NAT device, and it will assign a public address. And now NAT is an actual one-to-one private to public addressing. The thing that we typically use most often is PAT, where we have a single IP address that we put into the source IP slot in the IP packet, and then we assign it a port. Because we have a whole lot more ports, 65,535 usable ports, right? Does that sound right? A lot more ports than we're probably going to have IP addresses. The NAT itself, the one-to-one correlation becomes important if you're going to go, I think, from outside in. If we have, let's say a virtual server, where you have virtual computers, would it be kind of handy if you knew what IP address to get to and what port to get to? What if we didn't have that one-to-one relationship, that sometimes it's this IP address and sometimes it's that IP address and sometimes it's a different IP address? We wouldn't know how to get there, would we? Couldn't get there. So NAT is an actual one-to-one relationship. A source IP, a private IP address, an internal IP address, is represented externally by a specific IP address. And if you go home and ping ROA virtualpc.ecpi.net, you'll get a 199 something address, and I don't know what it is. And if you come here internally and you ping ROA virtualpc.ecpi.net, I hope you get 10.60.67.249. So the 10.60.67.249 internal IP address is represented externally as that address. DNS allows us to assign the same name, depending on which DNS server we're using, you assign the same name to different IP addresses so that it resolves properly on the public network and on the private network. But NAT, again, hides and it does hide the IP addresses from attackers. How many addresses do we actually need, public addresses do we actually need to run our internal network? Sometimes we're around 1, as long as we don't have any resources that we're trying to get people to. We just need one. And it looks like everybody's coming from the same address. We started using, you may have heard this story before, we started using a proxy server, which kind of does the same thing. A lot of years ago, when we had this really dynamic 56K connection and 300 students, that worked out real well. But proxy server caches things, but everything comes from the same IP address. So NAT, everything comes from the IP address. Everything appears to come from the same IP address on the outside. Don't have a real good indication, the attacker doesn't have a real good indication of how big your network is or what IP addressing scheme that you're using. So it reduces the number of IP addresses that we have to buy. Probably most of you, I know I am, I'm using PAT because I only bought one IP address. And all of the computers, whichever ones are on, all get on the internet using that one IP address, but they all have a port that gets translated to that IP address, and a particular port as the source. And then it comes back, goes to the NAT or the PAT table, and then routes the traffic to the correct private IP address. Privates are non-routable. We've been through that before. NAT removes a private IP address from the sender's packet and replaces it with an alias address. It is returned to NAT. The process is reversed. Who captures the packet from the internet cannot determine the actual IP address of the sender because that has been replaced. The original IP address, 192.168.0.3 here, is replaced with 192.168.146.118.20 is replaced in the source IP address of the IP header. Port address, I'm sorry? It'll still be the ephemeral port in that because we don't really care. This is the one we get the port address translation. If we only have a single IP address, then we have to keep track of the socket, the IP address, and the port. In the, what we'll still call it the NAT table, will be the PAT table in the NAT device. NAT device still does port address translation.
So PAT assigns
a port, yeah.
to your IP.
Yep, so that it uniquely identifies that connection. So when the answer comes back, it says, oh yeah, this is where it came from, sends it back to you. And PAT's what we use on our Linksys and D-Links and Netgear routers because they really don't even support NAT, true NAT, do they? I know mine doesn't. Network access control is something that's relatively new in the Microsoft world. It's available as a configuration change in Server 2003. It comes as a service in Server 2008. And it works on clients Windows XP Service Pack 3 and above. What this basically does, and they're going to say, and there are network access controls other than Microsoft, but that's the one that probably we've been most familiar with. And that's what most of the labs in this chapter are about, and I didn't assign you those. If you want, I'll set up a structure for you. Or if you really want a good place to do Microsoft labs, go search for the Microsoft virtual labs. They have a lot of virtual labs out there. And they're free. And if you're working on Microsoft certifications, those are the labs that they ask you to do on the certs. Kind of works out that way, huh? I don't know that necessarily be asked for all of them, but those are the ones if you do all of the labs for that particular certification, if they're supported. XP they don't support. It's mostly Windows 7 on up. Actually, they have some Vista machines out there in some of them. But what this basically does is examines, it says, the current state of the system or network. When you configure a client machine, a Windows 7, Windows Vista, Windows XP machine with network access control, and it tries to connect to the network, the server, through the health query, looks at the machine to see if it's got an antivirus software, if the antivirus software is up to date. Firewall's turned on, that's right. Is the firewall turned on? and is it patched? Is it up to date with Microsoft patches? If it is, then it will give you an IP address, and typically you use DHCP to control this thing. It will give you an IP address on the network you're trying to get to. If it fails any of these tests, it puts you into a quarantine subnet until you can meet the requirements to get onto the network. And what typically going to happen on the quarantine network is you'll have the ability to do the updating that you need in order to get admission onto the to the network where you're trying to go, where the resources are. This is one of the things that we've talked about before. You've heard me say, well, if somebody connects on a connection to your network, they're on your network. How do you know if they have an antivirus checker? This is a way to know that they have an antivirus checker. This is a way to know that the antivirus is up to date. This is a way to know that the computer's patched. It is part of the problem. Is it a complete solution? Obviously not. Cisco has one that they run through TACACS, which is pretty neat, that is used to access Cisco devices. It actually will configure it. You can configure it so that it will authorize a user to run certain commands on a router. Give them certain authority on the router. You can make them an administrator on the router, or you can give them just the ability to run particular commands on the router, which is pretty precise. Prevent computers with I like this word, suboptimal security for potentially infecting other computers through the network. So what this does is check to see if it's patched, if you've got the firewall on, and if you have a virus checker, an antivirus checker. And then we direct them to a VLAN, DHCP. These are the two ways to do it, DHCP, and DHCP I think is probably the most common because it's probably the easiest configuration to do when you configure these things. The other one uses ARP poisoning to prevent it from communicating on the network that it's on until the requirements of the health requirements are met. Once that happens, you automatically get put onto the network. It checks back on a regular basis to query to see if the conditions change, and you can now get the IP address on the network that you're trying to get to. The vendors, they talk about Cisco, the product name network admission control, Microsoft network access protection, Juniper unified access control, and then there's a trusted computing, which is an open vendor specification trusted network connect. Each of them, obviously a little bit different configuration, but each of them have the same purpose, is to check the clients to see if they have at least a minimal amount of security applied before they're on to your network. This is the 1, 2, 3, 4 security self-assessment by the health security agent. So what we're trying to do is get on to the system, goes to the health registration authority, a statement of health. Statement of health is sent to the health registration authority. Do I have all of these things? If we're cleared, we get the health certificate, present the health certificate down here to the network server on the network we're trying to get on, and yes, we're on the network. If we don't get the clearance, then no health certificate, then you're sent to the quarantine VLAN. You get an IP address in the quarantine area. When you look at these things, typically what they don't get in a lot of cases are default gateways, honestly. If you go through the process, and then the TechNet, that's the word. That's the labs that they have there. TechNet, search for TechNet online labs or something like that. They have a whole bunch of them, and this is one of the ones if you want to go through this process that they have. And oh yes, they have a step-by-step instructions on how to do these things. But if you do it, look at the one before you are cleared to see what the IP addressing looks like, and the one after you're cleared to see what the IP addressing looks like. It's kind of an interesting, it's a very interesting process to go through. Or if you want to do the ones at the end of the chapter, we can set up some Windows 8 or Server 2008 and Windows 7 machines that you can do that here. I haven't given you any Windows 2008 server machines. We're still using the XP and the have Windows 7 machines. I have them. We just didn't give them to you because we really haven't played with those a whole lot. These are just, this table is in your book, client-less, how you're going to do that. The key here is that even in Windows 7, this service, this client has to be turned on, otherwise it doesn't work. In Windows XP, if you don't have one that is compatible with this, there is a client that you can put on, a NAT client that you can put on Windows XP machines, which means that you got to do some planning before people go away and try to get in and connect remotely, because these clients have to be turned on. And the server obviously has to be configured. Other devices that they talk about, firewalls, and we'll spend a lot of time on firewalls in the firewall class. I think everybody goes through all three classes. I won't swear to it. But we have a separate one where we'll look at firewall configurations, and we'll do smooth wall at the command line, so all you non-Linux guys, you get to learn how to use Linux commands early on. And the Linux grads will help you out with that. It's scripting, so don't think about it as Linux. It really is scripting. Proxy servers, what a proxy server does is take whatever service that you're using, and we're more familiar with HTTP proxy because that's what we use here. And it goes to the internet to get the information for you. What a proxy server does, when you use the proxy server here, you go to www.youtube.com. Let's use Facebook. That's my favorite because that's where everybody's going. www.facebook.com. The request actually goes to the proxy server, so we know how many times you go. Goes to the proxy server. The proxy server rebuilds the request packet, and it actually goes on the internet and sends it to Facebook. The answer comes back from Facebook to the proxy server. It has, again, a table just like we had before, and it knows which IP addresses initiated which requests, and it rebuilds it and sends it back to your machine. So your IP address doesn't go out, your computer doesn't go out on the internet. What that does give you the ability to do is do an awful lot of look-in scanning, virus checking, spam filtering before the traffic actually gets inside your network. Proxy servers, ours is inside. Proxy servers, probably the best location for this guy would be in the DMZ. That way you can do all your filtering before the traffic actually gets inside your private network. Again, remember what we're trying to do is protect the private network. Honeypots, and they talk in there about honeypots, what can do and can't do. Depending on which security expert you read, honeypots are the greatest thing in the world or the worst thing anybody ever thought of. What a honeypot is designed to do is to, do research to see what's going on, and one of the things that they say is, what's going to be the next attack, because it's going to be a honeypot. Honeypot is an intentionally weakly configured device, server that that can be exploited. The other thing that they can be used for is to protect the real devices, which means there's something there that will occupy the attacker instead of attacking the real server. Probably some hazards to that, because if they figure it out, and you have to be real careful with this, because if they figure out it's a honeypot, they're just going to quit and go someplace else. So it can't be too easy. But what you want to do is make it easy enough that you can see what's happening. And I think typically what you would want here is to be able to see what the techniques are, particularly from an educational standpoint. What are the techniques? And I think that there are probably honeypot VMs at VMware. There are a lot of virtual machines at VMware, if you want to look at those things that do different things. Not a lot of Microsoft machines, obviously, although they do have some virtual machines there that are 180-day licenses and things like that. But a lot of security tools on virtual machines at VMware.com if you want to take a look at those things. Network intrusion detection, host and network intrusion prevention. The network intrusion detection system And a host prevention system, host and network prevention systems, look at the traffic and try to determine when something is improper. A detection system does that. It just detects that something's happened. Now, they do have a capability to have some action. But what a prevention system does is takes action to stop the attack. Network intrusion detection systems, and you can also have host intrusion detection systems. You'll see them abbreviated NIDS and HIDS, NIPS and HIPS for host for the prevention systems. The open source one that's available that you can get, open source obviously for free, and depending on how you configure it, whether it's a detection or a prevention system, is Snort. And yes, snort.org is where you would get it. It runs best in Linux, but it will run on Windows. It is ported to Windows, so you can run it on either system. Depending on how you set it up, how you configure it will make it either a detection system or a prevention system. Prevention system obviously has got to be something in line with the traffic. It's got to be able to detect the traffic as it comes in. These things have definitions. To stay with the most up-to-date Snort definitions, you have to buy a subscription, but if you don't, you get the ones like 2 weeks old. And for most of what we do, they're probably going to work. You don't have to have the latest and the greatest. And if you want, you can always write your own. Protocol analyzers, we've looked at the one that Microsoft provides in the Microsoft courses. The one that, and there are others, there are a lot of them out there. The one that obviously my favorite, the one that I have available for most of this stuff is Wireshark. It keeps getting better and better and better. Wireshark is the old Ethereal. Ethereal, the people that developed that one went to work for a new company, couldn't take the name, so they renamed it Wireshark. Same piece of software, except it's got so many updates since it was Ethereal that you really want the Wireshark itself. I think really a really good one. Internet content filters. Proxy servers kind of do content filtering. Actually, they do content filtering because we can look at the upper layers using a proxy server and block based on that or do filtering there. The content filters here are things that typically run on a router or a firewall, a service that runs there that inspects the packet as it's coming in to see what is actually in the packet before it gives it admission into the network. And then integrated network security hardware, obviously hardware that integrates a lot of these things. There are also software integrated hardware. The one I'm talking about, the firewall, Smoothwall, actually has a piece of software, has a lot of this capability, and it's got the firewall, it's got filtering, it's got a proxy server built into it, so you can find devices or software that do a lot of these different things. Do you want to do it there? Maybe, maybe not. It's up to you. Lots of options in these things. Now that I've talked about these, let's go through the slides and see what I missed. Typically used to filter packets. And the pictures that they showed, the DMZ, one of them had two firewalls, one of them had a router and a firewall. It doesn't really matter which you do. Keep in mind, though, that firewalls are not routers. They are packet filters. That's their job in life, is not to route. But it is have an internal and an external interface and look at the traffic that goes across it. Sometimes called a packet filter to prevent malicious attacks, can be software or hardware based, obviously. Hardware firewalls usually outside the network is the first line of defense. And it's the one that typically is going to be, and they just bug the heck out of me, these publishers, because what did they have on the other ones where they showed it? We had the filter router and the firewall. Now they swapped them. Mostly, I think what you're going to see in the way we're set up here, right, wrong, or indifferent, is filter router, DMZ, firewall. The firewall, I think, should be the thing that's closest to the private network because That's the thing that you don't want stuff to come in. What are we going to allow to come into the private network? Not very much, and that's where you want your firewall filtering. The firewall is also probably going to be your NAT device. Doesn't have to be. The router can be, but it's probably going to be your NAT device. Firewall's rule-based, establishes what action the firewall should take, and it can do one of three things: allow, block, or prompt. Do you really want this? But generally what they can do is either let it in or not let it in. And you got general rules, and the general rules are to let everything in or let nothing in. If you let nothing in, then you got to specify what you want to let come through the firewall. If you let everything in, then you're going to block specific things. I think to let everything in is probably pretty dangerous. We have two types, stateless and stateful. We'll put both of the slides up. What a stateless does, stateless is old, and the firewalls that you're going to see today are all going to be stateful. Stateless was just simply straight filtering. And the problem with that is, let's say we have a stateless firewall, and you go to the internet. What port did you use to go to the internet? No, it's a ephemeral port, some random port, right? Since stateless only uses filtering, permits or denies, based on a rule base, you go to the internet, and the answer comes back. Guess what? Unless you've allowed all those ports to be open, to come into your network, you're not getting in.
Establish. Did you do establish?
Not with stateless. Not with stateless. Stateful allows you to configure it, and most of them are actually configured as stateful to start with, except the Linux ones where you have to actually tell it that. When it goes out, a packet goes out, when I go out www.yahoo.com, it puts an entry in its state table that says, hey, I asked for yahoo.com. When the answer comes back, it checks the state table and says, yes, that connection originated from inside. The reason you want the state table is so that somebody from outside can't establish a connection from outside. What we do is allow the answers to come back, and that's what Matt was talking about, the established, and that is in a stateful firewall. Keeps track of the state of the connection so that we can get the answers back simply by configuring the firewall to do that. Stateless are old, and you're probably not ever going to see them, but they are still things that are real. Personal firewalls filter inbound, outbound traffic, and the firewall that's in Windows 7, actually, if you go to the advanced firewall configuration and not just the firewall, it has some pretty good control. Proxy server, we've talked about, goal is to hide the IP address of the client system. The goal can also actually be to check stuff before it gets onto your private network. But typically it does the connection with the firewall. The other thing is a reverse proxy. If you're going to allow connections into your private network, you can have a reverse proxy so that the user from outside connect to that proxy. It then communicates inside. Same separation there. That way you kept the users from outside off of your private network. And again, that's one of the options. And these are the proxy settings that are available in the network configurations, in the connections configurations. They look the same on all of them. A couple about HTTP, and then what's the port? If we're using a SQUID proxy, it's going to be whatever the IP address is, and the port's 3128, because that's the one that SQUID uses. Typically, a Microsoft proxy uses port 8080. You can assign it to any port that you want. The port here is the destination port of the proxy server. And then if you're going to use the same proxy server for all protocols, you can just check this here, and it'll put the IP address in the standard ports over here. Proxy servers are designed to set at the edge of the network and go out. They're not designed to look up private IP addresses. And typically what will happen is if you've got the proxy server turned on, you don't have the exceptions in here, it will not resolve addresses that you know you can resolve because they're right here, because it can't find them, because it's trying to go to the internet. If you have things that you resolve by both IP address, let's say Ranger and 10.60.66.253, if you use both of those addresses, they both have to be in here. Just because you can ping Ranger and get 10.60.66.253, the proxy server has no clue. If you say Ranger and then you try to go to 10.60.66.253, it won't go there. So you have to have both entries in if you use two entries. Honeypot, we talked about, intended to trap or trick attackers. One of the issues that they discuss in the book is entrapment for these things, and the courts actually have thrown some of the cases out because of entrapment. But typically located in the DMZ, and I think they probably, at least in the test banks, they asked that one. So the honeypot should be in the DMZ because we don't want these people again in our private network. You want it in the DMZ so that you can limit what is available and what goes on, and then once it is compromised, because that's one of the objectives of it, is to get it compromised, it's not on your private network. Software and data files appear to be authentic. You can't make it too easy. Actual imitations of real data files are there. It makes it look like it's the real server. You want to either see what's happening, see if you can find out what the next attack is, or steer the attackers to this thing instead of to the server with the actual data files on it. That hopefully is going to be more secure. The purposes: deflect attention, early warnings, or examine attacker techniques. Production and the types: production honeypots and research honeypots. Useful as well as alarming. Yes, it can. Studies using honeypots can be helpful in identifying attacker behavior and creating defenses. What do they do? What techniques do they use? And this means you're going to have some pretty good logging. Intrusion detection system watches for attempts to penetrate a network. And a couple of places, and you probably have heard me say this before, the difference between a network intrusion detection system and a network intrusion prevention system is you got the two techies at the water cooler, and for the NIDS, the one says to the other one, hey, did you see that really cool attack that happened yesterday? It detects attacks. The intrusion prevention system stops attacks. Now, these are all based on definitions that, again, for Squid you can download or you can write your own. They're not all based on that. That's one of the types. There are a number of, they're just like a number of different ways to teach antivirus software. Remember those? There are a number of different ways to teach NIDS and NIPS, HIDS and HIPS, how to detect bad traffic. Works on the principle of comparing a new behavior against normal or acceptable behavior. What's been defined as okay, been defined as normal. And what's defined as normal or okay today may be different tomorrow. And can these things make mistakes? Absolutely. Can virus checkers make mistakes? Absolutely. They look for suspicious patterns, and these are the things that they look at. What can an intrusion detection system do? Configure a firewall to filter out IP addresses. Again, even though they do detect, they're generally an after-the-fact action, even when they do take action. So they can, an active intrusion detection system can take action against the attack. Launch a separate program. This is the one I like. Play an audio file that says attack in progress. That's what you see on the movies all the time, isn't it? Attack in progress. Well, you can make this thing play the attack in progress for you if you want. The network is being attacked. So save the packet, send an entry to a system log file so that, again, you know you've been attacked. And you know when you've been attacked, but it didn't do anything to prevent the attack. Send an email, page a cell phone, or terminate the session, and this would be one of the active intrusion detection systems. Intrusion prevention system finds the malicious traffic and deals with it immediately. An intrusion prevention system is going to be in line with the traffic so that it looks at all the traffic. Keep in mind, anytime we do anything with this traffic, what's that going to do to your network speed? It's going to slow it down. Has to, because we're processing the packets. Anytime we encrypt something, it's going to slow it down, make it more secure. It's going to slow it down. They block traffic, and there are a number of different things. There are network intrusion prevention systems and host intrusion prevention systems. Host on a specific machine. You probably want to run it on a server. You may want to run it on your computers at home. There aren't as many of these that are free as there used to be. Squid is free. The problem that I have with Squid is that you've got to stop it in order to read the log files. It does have, I'll back off on that a little bit. It does have a GUI front end that actually will read the log files as it's going on, but it's kind of a pain to configure, and it has a lot of lies in its configuration document. So the intrusion prevention system monitor the following desktop functions. The system calls, the file system access, the registry, and the host input output, what's going on, and it's looking for what's normal and abnormal based on definitions typically. With an existing antivirus and the firewalls, and if they didn't integrate, we would really create a mess for ourselves. Network intrusion prevention systems do the same thing as the host intrusion prevention systems. It's just where they are configured on the network. If it's in line, we're going to have something like, well, something like a hub, or configure it on the router. The Cisco routers, I know, do have intrusion prevention systems, and Cisco provides, for a fee, the definitions that go along with these things. So if you stop it on the router, that's a great place, isn't it? Because then it doesn't get any further. Or the firewall. You can configure most of the new routers as firewalls unless you have a really large network. Protocol analyzers, we've kind of looked at these, and we'll look at them more, do some analysis in the next class. What we're doing with these things, say 3 ways of detecting potential intrusion, statistical anomalies, look at the network traffic, and use a protocol analyzer technology. And Matt was looking at the Cain and Abel, right? Did it have some kind of oddities in this when you looked at it?
Well, it was playing around with Cain and Abel. I was looking at Wireshark
Yep.
in the background.
Right. And
It had some ARP.
it had some ARPs?
It had like a...
It actually had one command in there that said, there's something going on here. I mean,
Yeah,
not in that exact words. It said, there's something really odd going on here. Too many default gateways around. Huh?
Same MAC address.
Same MAC address, too many machines. So can you detect some of this stuff? Yeah. Security is paying attention to what's going on your network. It really is. And what's going on your machine. Don't just click, okay. Yes, I want to install this virus. Thank you very much. Connection filters monitor the traffic and block access to pre-selected websites and files. You can do the same thing with a proxy server. We can block access to certain files. As a matter of fact, I think if you go to www.espn.com, you get a blue screen that says you can't go there during class hours or something like that. What happens at 1 o'clock? It's okay because it's after class hours. And a lot of these configurations that are on this proxy server right now were done when the bandwidth was much less than it is now, less than T1 speed. So bandwidth really was a big deal at the time. Unapproved websites can be restricted based on a URL or by matching keywords. You can do some of that configuration in the new Windows systems too, can't you? If we don't approve a URL, then you can't go there. This would be really secure. Probably the bank, right? Did they let you go any place on the internet? Mm-mm. They let you go anywhere on the internet. If you're brave enough to go. But they're monitoring, I'll bet you, huh? How long does it take them to get there?
To get where?
To you, after you try to go on the internet.
I don't know about who's actually got control, but they can't fire you still.
Yeah. Integrated network security hardware is hardware that's designed to do these services that we've been talking about. It can be a single security service or multiple services, and you're probably going to have one that does multiple services. Upside, downside, going to be less cost, but if it gets compromised, then all your services are compromised. It's like everything else. The ideal is to split everything out so that one device runs each individual service. Not always practical. So quite a bit of territory here. Configuration, we'll go through these all. What did we really talk about? Let's go back. Subnetting, configuration. How are you going to set it up to make it more difficult? Are you going to stop people entirely? I don't think so. But if you set up subnets, we can set up filters because we're going to have to route between the subnets. So you can set up filters on the routers. Similar to subnetting and all of those different things. NAT and NAC. NAT changes the IP address. It really does conserve IP address. NAT is the reason that we're still on IPv4, by the way, also. Network access control allows us to check, to configure the network so that it checks the client, so that a minimal security configuration is in place before they actually get onto the network. The virus checker and the patches, firewall on it being the big deals. Lots of different security devices, a pretty good list there, and we'll look at some of those in other classes. Some of them we won't do a whole lot more with, some of them we will. Firewall we will, proxy server we will. We'll take a quick look at intrusion detection / prevention system. So we'll look in more detail at some of these devices. Protocol analyzers we'll look at. Got some activities for you to do in the next class with protocol analysis. Nothing dramatic. You just need to start looking at packets, what's normal, what's not normal. And you need to look at your network occasionally to see what the packets look like now so that something odd's going on. Well, let's look at it and see if we have something to compare it against. Baselining is a really big deal. How do you know if something's wrong if you don't know what's right? Intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, mostly probably the same piece of software or hardware. It just depends on where it's sitting in the traffic flow. If all the traffic is being looked at, then it's going to be a network device. If it's on an individual device, then it'll be a host device. And I'll quit. Questions? Comments? No rude remarks. I'm not going to allow them today.
The snort rules have snort means have live in it.
Well, no.